Again, welcome to our webinar today. We have folks joining us from across the country, and we're grateful for your presence with us, the Conference of Major Superiors of Men, and the work that I do in the Justice and Peace initiatives. We're enthusiastic about having Kim Daniels with us, and we'll get started with introductions in just another minute. Welcome to our webinar today. I am going to put in the chat the Institute at Georgetown, where Kim is joining us from. And so if you're curious about her background, we'll also do a little bit of the bio, but that's in the chat for you. Another just quick piece of housekeeping, we will be using the chat for questions and answers that I can facilitate in conversation with Kim. So any questions that you have, feel free to put them there. This is a webinar format, which means that the panelists will be able to see those questions. We don't have an open mic, as you're aware, open microphone type of situation here. All right. Well, we looks like our attendees are rolling in the door, so we'll go ahead and I'll begin with a welcome. So welcome to this session on writing editorials and opinion pieces to contribute to civic dialogue. My name is Dr. Bethany Welch, and I am the Justice and Peace Fellow for the Conference of Major Superiors of Men. This fall, we began convening a series of skill building workshops in the context of justice and peace work. In September, we spoke about advocacy in an election year, really with an eye toward what the IRS regulations say for nonprofits and some of the best practices. In October, we hosted a diversity and inclusion leader, Mr. Dennis Okema, who spoke about recognizing bias and implementing anti-racism policies and practices in institutions and organizations. Today, as the general election results continue to come in and the makeup of state, local, and federal government is changing, we are gathered to learn from Kim Daniels about how to call on these returning and newly elected officials to take up perhaps a new approach or a new perspective or even a renewed charge on a particular issue of justice that is of concern to your local community, to your institute, or to people that you are accompanying and in relationship with. Kim Daniels is the Associate Director of the Initiative on Catholic Social Thought and Public Life, located at Georgetown University. She was appointed by Pope Francis as a member of the Vatican Dicastery for Communication in 2016. She's also a consultor to the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops Committee for Religious Liberty and has advised the USCCB and other Catholic institutions on a broad range of issues where church teachings intersect with public life, including immigration, human life and dignity, religious liberty, and care for creation. Now, I don't know about you, but as the last 8 months have unfolded, I have certainly looked to the Institute and to Kim as a convener and facilitator of important conversations during the pandemic. I found myself regularly tuning into webinars where I hear compelling voices speak on pressing issues over the last 8 months. And so as we were preparing to ask, who could help us learn to shape our voices as leaders in religious life, as leaders within various advocacy and initiatives, who could help us think about that messaging and how to shape a voice and to be consistent with our Catholic teaching and the ways kind of proceeding. So again, as we begin and as you're joining us, we'll be using the chat for questions for Kim that we will most likely be addressing at the end, unless there's something really urgent. But what we're also doing is we're recording this session, and the recording will be posted on the CMSM website. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Kim, and she'll share a little bit more about her background in communication, and then proceed with kind of the nuts and bolts of writing editorials and opinion pieces. Thank you so much, Kim.
Thank you, Bethany. Thank you all for having me and for being here today. What a slow news month we're having, right? We have, I think in the last couple weeks. We have the election of the second Catholic president in U.S. history. We have the McCarrick report. We have the USCCB meeting. We have all sorts of potential policy issues related to the new election, from migration and refugee issues to the dignity of life, to climate change, to religious liberty, to issues of poverty. We're facing many serious issues as Catholics, and it's really important, and I think our responsibility as Catholics, to be engaged in public life and to add our voices where we can. And all of you on this call are engaged Catholic leaders in one way or another. And I'm here today to hopefully help you a little bit in helping get your voices out there through op-eds, through other kinds of writing that might be an avenue for you to get your voices out there. One of the things that I'm going to tell you is that when you start writing, you should establish your credibility right off the front. So I want to tell you a little bit about my communications background more specifically, and then we're going to get into the nuts and bolts of all of this. My original background is as a lawyer, and I think that's important to say because we're trained to persuade, to take a complicated issue, to get our heads around it right away, and then to persuade people on it, even if they're not disposed to hear it. I also did communications work, shifted from legal work into communications for the church. I was the spokesperson for the president of the USCCB when that was Cardinal Timothy Dolan. As many of you will know, Cardinal Dolan doesn't necessarily need a spokesperson. And so I was more of a communications advisor, I would say, and really learned a lot in that role as to how to shape different kinds of messages and themes to get them out into public life. I also shifted about after a year to work for a lot of other Catholic institutions, consulting from home. I have a bunch of kids, and so it was just easier for me to work from home and to do that with a broad variety of groups. And then as Bethany mentioned, I am a member of the now Dicastery for Communication with the Vatican. And in that role, I've helped in a number of different ways over there, over in Rome, most particularly, most importantly, I think, with the February 2019 meeting on the protection of minors in the church. So because of all of that, I've really learned a range of different issues. I was involved in the rollout of Laudato Si here in the United States. I've worked on major efforts on migration and refugee issues. I've worked on major religious liberty issues. And I've ghost written and written under my own byline a gazillion op-eds, I feel like. So with all that in mind, I want to hopefully can get you here today to let you know that getting an op-ed out there, getting your thoughts on paper or on a screen and getting them out to people who hopefully you can persuade is something relatively easy and straightforward. There's a process to it. And I'm confident that those of you here on this call can do this and can get your voices into these important conversations that we're facing. Here's what I'll hope to do with you today. First, talk about a general approach to communications, because I think these principles are important for any way you're trying to communicate on important public issues. Secondly, I'll talk about op-ed writing basics. What are the nuts and bolts of getting an op-ed down on paper, up on your screen, and out to a media outlet that hopefully will publish it for others to read it and receive it? And third, I'm going to talk about how you can be your own comms director, right? How you can take an op-ed, pitch it to a publication, pitch it to a media outlet, get it out there, and then leverage that op-ed into other communications opportunities so that you can make sure that the message you want to convey is something that is reaching the broadest number of people. So with that, let's get to it. First, general and specific communications principles. How do you communicate a challenging message to both broad and distinctive audiences? The first thing I want to say is that substance drives communication. You can't have effective communication without something real to communicate, something substantive. So for instance, think about the abuse crisis. There's no magic wand that you can sort of wave, no words that you can say to try to spin in some way any kind of communication on this grave and serious issue. We have to have substantive steps to respond to the grave crisis of clergy sexual abuse. And you can't communicate on that or try to spin it in any way. In fact, that would be gravely wrong. And so I just want to take that through everything we're talking about, right? We're here to communicate about substance. We're not talking about messaging, which is a word I really hate, or spin or anything else. We're here to talk about how do you take your substance and communicate it effectively, using communications tools to help move us forward together. So the first step in effective communications is understanding the environment that you're operating in. I think it's safe to say that we all understand that our current communications environment, particularly our social media environment, is hostile, it's divisive, it's tribal, it's toxic. It amplifies crises and it erodes trust and it undermines authority. It is a very difficult environment to enter into. And because of this, we have to work to be effective in that environment, right? What's the right posture we should take is something we should all ask ourselves. Should we retreat? Should we just talk to people who agree with us? Should we be as snarky and as mean and as hostile as the next guy? And that's the way to win, and that's the way to effectively communicate. To my mind, the better approach comes from St. Francis de Sales, and he is the patron saint of journalists. And I think it's be who you are and be that well. We should act as we're called to act by our Catholic faith. And in particular, you should act in the way that you feel like you're called to do, like you're called to speak to the public, issues you're called to respond to. So we're all called as Catholics to hold the weakest and most vulnerable close and to try to live out the gospel and keep that at the center of anything that we are communicating. I think being who we are and being that well as Catholics means being humble and honest and pastoral and fostering of communion, especially in these divisive times. We've seen that kind of counter witness, I think, in many ways from Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti just recently. He talked about the fact that we're all in this together, right? That the main message he is conveying is that we are all interconnected and we all stand in solidarity with one another. And I think that is a guiding principle that we can take for our communications going forward. The idea is to just get out of our heads, right? Is to stop thinking big thoughts, stop creating all these sort of intellectual games in your head and go ahead and write out, go ahead and do what you're called to do, live out the gospel. I think we heard that at the USCCB meeting yesterday from Archbishop Pierre, the papal nuncio. In terms of specific principles, the first is that effective communications appeals to moral intuitions. It's not about facts and figures, and you shouldn't be thinking of yourself as trying to win a debate. You're not trying to beat somebody else. The idea is about thinking about why people believe what they believe and appealing to that, appeal to their positive intentions. So for instance, if you're writing about abortion, if you're trying to convey a pro-life argument, the idea is not to sort of establish a proof for why an unborn child is a human life and a human person that should be protected by law. That's one way to do it. But you're not always going to convince people on that score. Another way to do it might be to say, we recognize that people who don't accept our views on abortion have moral intuitions in their heart, right? That they care for the mother who is facing an unplanned pregnancy. And how can we say that we can support both the mother and the child together? How can we appeal to that moral intuition? That's something that often persuades people. Effective messages, secondly, also speak to the audience. You're not trying to convince those that agree with you already. You're not trying to sound clever to yourself and your friends. You're trying to persuade a particular audience. Thirdly, effective messages are consistent. They're unburdened, by which I mean they're not burdened with jargon or all sorts of architecture surrounding them. They're brief and they're ear-worthy. They sound good to your ears. And finally, I want to say, as a just general rule here, that people really will remember how you make them feel. You should be thinking of anything you write as also an encounter with another person, right? That comes through in your writing, and it should come through in your writing. So again, play to your strengths. Be who you are and be that well. I think Pope Francis is a wonderful example of this. You know, he really works to witness to his faith. He works to present an image of our shared faith through his personal witness. We can all think of images throughout his papacy that have become iconic, whether it is him embracing a disfigured boy in St. Peter's Square, or more recently, standing in St. Peter's Square at the beginning of the COVID crisis, in the dark, in the rain, all alone, with that Urbi et Orbi address, right? He is communicating through an image, and he is communicating through who he is. You can do that through your writing as well, and I'll be here today to tell you a little bit more about that. So let's get to it. Let's get to op-ed basics, how we can sit here, how you can sit down, get to a table, and write a strong, informed, and focused message on something that's important to you. The first thing to do is to step back. What do you do before you start to write? What do you want to say? That's your first question. What do you really want to communicate? I call this your big shiny object, right? If you could have one thing that you wanted to communicate and give to people, what would that one thing be? So I'm just going to take one example that occurred from last week, right? Raising the refugee cap will help persecuted Christians leave places of violence for a home in the United States. That might be something I want to communicate as a policy issue going forward. If that's my one idea, that's what I want to focus on. How I can say that one big shining object, one idea that I'm going to focus on through my 800 words of my op-ed. That's your lead, and that's what you want to make sure you put front and center throughout your piece. And the way to think about that is ask yourself if there's just one headline, one idea, one takeaway message that your audience remembers 3 months from now from your piece, what do you want that to be? So sit down and imagine what you want that one sentence to be. I think of something Father Jim Martin said about Fratelli Tutti. He said, if Laudato Si said everything is connected, Fratelli Tutti says everyone is connected. That to me is an effective takeaway message, and that would be an effective lead for an op-ed. And the best way to begin planning your op-ed is to think about what that one message would be. Second question to ask yourself is, who is my audience? Who is my primary audience? Who will this reach that I want to reach out to and that I want to think about when I'm writing it? So let's say you have a message that you want to deliver about the importance of admitting more refugees into the United States, right? You want to think about what kind of audience you want to reach on that. Do you want to reach people that are already persuaded about it, but call them to action, call them to really move on this issue? Do you want to reach people that are opposed to that? Because I think that is a bad idea for one reason or another. So different kinds of frames that you might work would be from moving someone from being opposed to an issue to being supportive of it, moving someone from inaction to action, or moving someone from being unaware of an issue altogether to being aware of it, right? So you're asking yourself, who is my audience and what do I want them to do? As you think about writing, as you think about what you want to say in your piece. And these are questions that you do before you even start putting words on a screen. And once you do that, then you think about also where I might think about this going. And I'll talk a little bit more about how to pitch to particular media outlets. But I also think you should begin before you write and think a little bit about what kind of a piece you want to write, where you might see it being placed. So for instance, is this something you want to do for a larger secular audience, right? Do you want to shoot for a major media outlet? Do you want to shoot for a local media outlet that reaches a secular audience? You want to shoot for a Catholic publication where you will reach either a Catholic elite audience or maybe a broader general Catholic audience. Please consider reaching out to Spanish language media, which is hugely important and something that we don't consider often enough. If you have that skill, for sure, that is a wonderful place to start looking. But the question really is, where do I see this going? Because that'll take a different kind of op-ed style, whether you're going to be more general in more common sense, everyday language, or whether you're going to pitch it at a level that might reach specialists, might reach Catholics or non-Catholics, et cetera. And again, we'll talk about in that as I move forward about how to pitch to different outlets and what you should be looking for. But I just want to say that before you start writing, you really should have that in mind because that affects who your audience is. So moving on, let's get writing. The first thing to do, right, is to think about your introduction, your lead, your news hook, your big shiny object, as I was talking about. If you're trying to get something out there, if you're trying to place an op-ed, you really need to have some kind of a news hook so that an outlet, a media outlet will accept it. Right now, if we were talking about refugee admissions, as I mentioned earlier, President-elect Joe Biden last week talked at Jesuit Refugee Services about raising the cap on refugees. Now would be a good time, if you wanted to write about that this week, to place an op-ed on that, pointing back to that news hook. Even better would have been last Friday or on Monday, right? Because nowadays the news cycles happen very, very quickly. So don't let it slow you down, right? If, in other words, again, this is a simple matter of getting 700 or 800 words on your screen, on paper, whatever. but you have to be aware of news hooks as they happen and ready to jump on them. Another way to think about a news hook, though, is that you can predict them going forward. So you look ahead. If you are a comms director, right, you're looking ahead with a media calendar to the next month, 2 months, 3 months, and you're predicting what's going to happen. We know all sorts. We know the inauguration is going to be here. That's a wonderful time to talk about political issues. We know Christmas is coming, and the week before Christmas might be an important time to talk about. Again, it could be about, we could use, talk about Mary, Joseph, and Jesus as refugees themselves. We could use the Feast of Our Lady of Guadalupe to talk about issues of migration, or we could use news hooks related to various different policy issues, the March for Life, for instance, as a time to talk about life issues as well. So look ahead and try to predict news hooks to give yourself a little bit of time to do some writing. But as they come up, you can also be prepared to jump in and write right away. So we're writing, you've got your news hook, and you've got your big idea that you want to communicate. As you start with your introduction, your first couple paragraphs of writing, your introduction is the most important part of what you're going to write. And the first thing you need to do is demonstrate credibility. As I said up front, why should people listen to you? Why should they read what you wrote? There's all sorts of reasons you could think about. It could be something in your background. It could be your work history. It could be something in your personal life or contributions you've made to your field. It could be your understanding of Catholic social thought or your experience working in a particular area of Catholic practice. But the point is, be sure that you establish in some way why your reader should be listening to you. Keep this very concise and essential. This is not to give yourself a huge, sort of description of your background. You're not the center of the piece, but be sure you establish it. The second thing is to establish relevance for your audience, right? Why is this important to them? Why does it matter to them? Do you have something new to say about it that they haven't heard before? Do you have a particular perspective that's going to be different than the 10 other things they've read on this? Think about that when you're beginning to write. Also in your introduction, try to build excitement for what you're trying to say, right? What is it that is going to get the person to read beyond that initial paragraph? The first thing is to just offer up a really bold statement in the beginning, right? Share a story, pose a rhetorical question, create some sort of suspense or tension. There's all sorts of tools you can use in that introduction, but it should be something that keeps the reader going down after that first 100 words. But your most important section, again, is going to be that first paragraph. And a trick I often use, by the way, is that I get myself writing. I sometimes it's hard to just get something out there, right? We all sit and stare at a blank screen or a blank piece of paper or whatever it is, and it's hard to get started. I try to get myself, I think about who my audience is, what I want to communicate, and then I just start writing, and I just start brainstorming, and I just start going, and I get a draft down, and then I go back and I revise it. And oftentimes the conclusion that I come to at the end of that process is now I've kind of thought it through and worked it through. And that conclusion, that last 2 or 3 sentences in that last short paragraph will often be a great way to state my introduction. So I often cut it and I bring it up and I make it the introduction because you've worked it through, you've come to sort of the end and you've given yourself a punchy way to say it once you've worked the whole issue through. And now you can say to yourself, this is really a much better introduction for my piece, and write something else at the end. Because again, your best sentences should be those first ones. So that's just a trick I often use. So we've talked about the introduction. Let's talk about the body of your op-ed or your editorial. The first thing is that you really should be focused on how it sounds, not how it looks. So many of you might come from academic backgrounds, or you write in a more academic sense or to a more scholarly audience, or maybe you write for an audience of specialists, right? People who speak Catholic lingo. I think I said solidarity earlier. That's an example of a word that probably all of us here on this call are very comfortable with. But most of the people who would be audiences for our op-eds might not be familiar with. So an example is to be writing for the ears of your audience and what they can hear and understand, even though something looks good on paper and uses jargony words that we might use in our specialties. That's not the way you should be thinking about an op-ed. So what do I mean by writing for the ear? Use short words. As Winston Churchill once said, short words are the best and old words that are short are the best of all. Just short, simple words. Short, simple sentences. if you look at the best speeches that have ever been given, right, the Gettysburg Address, any speech that is held up as a model, you will invariably find that the most memorable lines are fewer than 20 words. Short sentences are powerful. If you have a lot of clauses stacked up in a sentence, cut it up. Use everyday words. So again, imagine speaking to your neighbor. When I write something, I have a good friend at my parish who is an engaged lay Catholic, right? And she is a busy mom she's a friend, she's a busy mom at our school, in our parish. She has a job. She is involved in our church in our parish, but she does not spend every day thinking about, the refugee cap or issues of solidarity or all the rest, although she lives them, frankly, better than anyone I know. When I'm writing something, I think about her. If I were going to have a conversation with her, how would I be talking about it? How would I be talking to this friend of mine who shares some of my beliefs, but not all of them? And how would I be most persuasive? So I would challenge you to find someone in your life that you can think about in that way, someone who knows enough about and is engaged enough about this issue to be interested in it, but is not going to be ready or interested in hearing the kind of jargony specialist words that we're often used to using. So use everyday words. Use contractions. Again, that's something that we're often trained in our specialist writing on to do. Go ahead and do it for an op-ed. They're much more casual than you would expect. And then finally, when you're done, read it out loud to yourself. See how it sounds, see if it flows, see if it's tight. I think I've mentioned already, we're looking for 700 to 800 words. You really should, when you're pitching something, almost every media outlet will have guidelines on their site about how long a piece should be if you submit it to them. We can talk about longer pieces for different kinds of publications, but if we're talking here about op-eds, we're really talking generally about 800 words, and really do not go over that, right? That's a mark for you, and it's just a simple way for an editor to put your email in trash folder is to say, it's over my word limit. So again, read it out loud, make sure it flows, make sure the language is simple and straightforward. How do you end it? We're going to have some kind of call to action in most of these, right? And again, we have all sorts of ways we want to frame it. Maybe we're just making people aware. Maybe we're trying to shift them from opposing a position to supporting a position, or maybe we're calling them to action. Hopefully, a lot of what you write will be some kind of a call to action. And if you're doing that, here are some principles for that. Don't ask for too much. Make sure you're specific. Don't have a vague request. And make it easy for people to execute, right? So if you're going to have some kind of a call to action to round out or conclude your piece, make sure it's something easy that someone can execute, and give them alternatives, right? Something that's a little bit aspirational and something they can do in a pretty straightforward manner. Aim high, but again, at the same time, give them something they can do to become initially engaged in the issue. And often, if you're trying to instead of, that's a call to action, if you're trying to persuade someone, or if you're trying to move the needle, right, nudge them in their opinion a little bit, then just start slow, right? Don't ask somebody to go from one polarized position to the other end in another polarized position. Ask them to accept a little bit of an issue, take one step towards you. So for instance, if you have if you're trying to convince someone to use the model we've been doing, that more refugees should be admitted here in the United States, you might appeal to them by talking about our history, right? You might appeal to them by talking about, again, persecuted Christians and people of other faiths around the world for who can find a home here in the United States. But maybe someone is concerned about issues of safety, or they think that in their heads, it's not going to be easy to ramp up very fast or something, right? You don't have to convince them that we should have an open doors policy, right? You don't want to be saying that. You want to say that you want to say that we're going back to a traditional policy. We've worked with issues of safety before, and all we're asking is to return to something that was the status quo ante 4 years ago. So in other words, you're not asking them to become someone they're not. You're asking them to do something that, in their mind, just was here 4 years ago, say. A sample framework for an op-ed, again, just to round this section out, would be to start off by saying who you are and how you connect to the issue you're discussing, how you see all this as being part of a larger issue, and what your specific reasons are for supporting it. I'm going to shift and talk about climate issues here for a minute. So for instance, let's say you are working in a let's say you work in a diocese, right? And you want to talk about your connection to the moral cause for action on climate issues. You might talk about your Catholic faith. You might talk about your work. You might talk about Laudato Si, and why you believe that there is a connection for you to this existential issue for our world. That's how you can create it, connect what you do in your diocese to something larger, right? That this is a larger issue that affects people around the world. And then you could say why you specifically support action on climate change. This might draw from your own background, your own work experience, your own support in your community and what you do. So in other words, rooted in something particular related to your work or your personal life, not just the 30,000 feet view. And then finally, again, there's that call to action or call to a change of belief. Final thing I want to talk about is how to be your own comms director. So again, we've talked about how to start off an op-ed, how to work on the body of it and be simple and move through it, and how to round it out with a call to action or a way of nudging people to change their beliefs. We've talked about how to get words on the screen or on paper, right? Just start writing, figure out what your big shiny object or your lead is, figure out what your structure is going to be, and then just start writing and maybe consider taking the conclusion you end up with and putting that up as your introduction. And now I'll just say, what do you do once you have it? And the first thing to do is to pitch it to different media outlets. And the second thing to do is to, once you get it placed somewhere, try to leverage it. So once you've written something and spent all this work, make sure you leverage it so that you can get as many people hearing your message as possible. So what do I mean by that? First, let's talk about pitching it. Pitching it means you're sending an email with your op-ed in it, pasted in it, and you want to get it received somewhere. The first thing to do to have an effective pitch is you're writing to an editor, you're looking at a media outlet site, and there'll be an obvious place to send your op-eds, right? They'll often have the place to send pitches, the editor's name who will receive them. So the first thing is explain your news hook and your connection to it. What makes this issue relevant right now? How is your angle different from everybody else who might have opinions on this? What makes you the best person to write this op-ed? What's your particular expertise or experience? Why are you a good person to write it? What's your perspective that you bring to it? And again, this doesn't have to mean that you are the world's expert on it. It might be that you have a particular experience. It might be that you know Catholic social teaching really well, and that it's something that has a great deal of relevance to a particular issue, and the audience for that media outlet doesn't hear it too often. And then if you have some sort of an unexpected point of view, that's even better, right? So if you have something that is not predictable from who you are, that's even better, and put it in the op-ed. So for instance, I would say that there are things that media outlets often get Catholics writing about certain sets of issues. If you have something different that you can present that is still in line with Catholic social teaching, that might be something that's important, and that will get an editor's attention. Your pitch letter, your pitch email should be very brief. It needs to be comprised of what your idea is, right? So here's who I am. Here's why this issue is relevant. Here is my idea about it. And then just be sure, obviously, to put in your contact information, and just paste the finished piece in the email. You can attach it also, but really you should just paste it, because you're going to get one chance at them reading this. They're going to read the pitch email, they're going to read your 800 words or what have you, and then they're going to make a decision, or they're going to file it away. You need to follow up with them after that. So you've sent the pitch email, follow up. If the editor responds or not, you're going to follow up. So if they respond, you thank them one way or another, yes or no. Obviously, you're trying to build a relationship with an editor. If they don't respond, especially if there's a timely and sort of urgent news hook, give them 24 hours, whatever the timeliness is, depending on how fast your news cycle is. And then write them back and say that because your hook is time sensitive, because this issue is going away, right? It only has another day on it. That let's say you're going to you're going to pull the piece after an additional 24 hours or whatever it might be. Obviously, all of this is very polite, and you're trying again to build a relationship. And the amount of time here will really depend on what your particular situation is. But once you've sent it to one outlet, and again, you can only send to one outlet at a time. If you haven't gotten the response back in whatever a reasonable amount of time is, write them again, say, thank you for considering it, you're going to pull it, or thank you for considering it. After another 24 hours, I'm going to pull it and submit it to another outlet, and we appreciate your consideration. And then finally, of course, always have backup plans. You've had an initial media outlet in your mind, but really don't be always aiming for the New York Times or the Washington Post or USA Today or what have you. If you have some idea that that's a place you might get because of a particular expertise or experience you have, that's great. But please have other kinds of backup plans in mind, and particularly for your first efforts at writing, you should be looking at local outlets for sure. And this is a great place to get practice, a great place to get exposure, a great place to build relationships. So local outlets are very important, and please look to them. There's so much great Catholic media out there, and I won't go through it now. I mean, if we want to talk about any questions, I'm happy to, but so many great Catholic media outlets out there. And here's what I mean about going to sort of an unexpected source. If you're someone who someone would predict would be someone who would write at the National Catholic Reporter, maybe pitch something to the National Catholic Register sometime, and vice versa. Those are much more likely to get, the unexpected writer is likely to get picked up, and you're going to be reaching an audience that you might not always get a chance to reach. So think about that. But Catholic outlets should really be the place that you're focused as you're getting started in this. And we just have a wonderful, wonderful range of them. Also, as I said earlier, if you are able to write in Spanish, if you are a Spanish language speaker, please do consider that. There's just a wealth of wonderful media outlets out there that you should be pitching to. And then finally, I would say how to leverage it. I think that what you should do is once you've gotten something published, you've written that text, you have it, that can serve as the script for a radio show. That can serve as sort of a pitch to a TV station. Again, generally a Catholic TV station or a Catholic radio show. That's where we're starting. But once you have an op-ed, that is a really good product to send to a radio producer or a television producer and say, I'm prepared to talk about this issue, and here's what I would say. And again, in particular, as you're starting, start with Catholic radio. They're always looking for content. They really will accept a broader range of views than you might think. And if you have an op-ed, they basically have a script that they can see what you're going to say. And so again, it just gives you practice. It gets you more of an audience to reach. And as you build your portfolio of places that you've published, places that you've spoken, you're going to grow your audience later. So let's say you place your first piece in some sort of a Catholic outlet. Then let's say I place it at the National Catholic Reporter, and then I use what I wrote as a script for a Catholic radio show. The next time around, I can leverage that up, right? And maybe I'm going to the religion section, the faith column in a secular news outlet, and maybe I'm reaching out to a local radio station. So that's how it works. You get your practice, you move up, you broaden your places that you're writing, and you'll build a body of work and a set of experience. And most of all, you will affect people and work to persuade them on issues that are important to us as Catholics. So with that, I will end. Thank you for your time. I'm very nuts and bolts. I hope it was helpful, and I'd love to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Kim. I feel like I'm like, whew.
I talked fast, and I apologize about that. That was a lot to get out in one session. So
yeah, the first question we had in the chat was if you could go back and repeat. I think it's 4 steps in the framework for the op-ed, or yes. It might be 3. But yeah, if you could just walk us through those again one more time so people can get them in their notes.
Sure. So the first step is your in your introduction, right? What are we doing? So that your introduction is what we have first, and you're demonstrating credibility and your relevance, right? Why are you the person to write this? Why are you going to be a credible source here? How do you have information that is relevant? And then you're building some excitement about what you want to say, okay? And then in the body, we go from the introduction. Then in the body, we talked about how you can use simple words, short sentences, right for the ear, not the eye. And then we talked about ending it with some sort of either call to action or some sort of persuasion, moving someone in the needle, nudging their opinion a little bit, right? Or also making them aware, going from unaware to aware of an issue. Those are all ways to end it, all sorts of actions, persuasive things that you're trying to accomplish.
Wonderful, thank you. I had a question, and certainly we encourage other folks to continue to add to the chat as we're talking, but you know, I think about particularly our men religious, and I know there's a number of women religious on the call who are in positions of accompaniment.
Yeah.
So it is not necessarily their firsthand lived experience, but it is knowledge that comes from encounter.
Sure.
How do you, in a compelling way, relate that story to support perhaps a call to action? I'm thinking around DACA right now. So, you know, I personally accompany a number of DACA folks. And if I were to write an op-ed and I want to talk about the experiences of these young people, but I don't want to appropriate the story, right? And so how do you find that line between storytelling for the purpose of, you know, persuasion, but keeping the sacredness of that storytelling? Any suggestions or thoughts?
I think you've just done a good job of doing that, Bethany. I think the idea, right, is that stories are really an effective way to communicate on any of these issues, right? So just let me back up for a second. You have an opinion that you want to convey, or you want to convey a certain principle of Catholic social teaching, right? Welcome the stranger. And you want to go from there to giving, to illustrate that, to convince on it, to persuade. You might have some facts, you might have different information about policies. Most effective will always be stories. And obviously they fit within this architecture, but stories are always going to be most effective. How do you do it without sort of objectifying or using someone just to sort of convey your point and win an argument? I think the first thing to say is that really to use their own words. So if you can, you know, speak and let that person speak. If you can, with their permission, you know, have it be a real person and have them talk in their own voice with their own name. Obviously, you need to get permission for anything like that. But that would be the idea, is to have the person talk in their own voice. And that is truly the most effective. We do that at the initiative. You know, when we try to have a conversation about, we did one, as an example, on Catholic social thought in the coronavirus crisis, right at the beginning, as in last March, as this was all hitting. And instead of trying to convey what it was like to be an undocumented immigrant facing the coronavirus crisis, to convey what it was like to be a small business owner, what we did was put folks who live those lives in conversation with our experts on public policy and our experts on Catholic social thought. Because again, it's just much more effective that way. And most importantly, their voices are just as important. So put those in your story, I think, in their own words. But when I said you just did it effectively, Bethany, what I meant by that was describe what you're doing, right? Describe that you are accompanying somebody, that this is a sacred thing that you're doing it because you're called to do so by your faith. And I really do mean that. I think that too often we try to frame things in language that is secular. We try to sort of make it, just as general as possible, as least common denominator as possible. I think that people respect and value when people come at it from their deeply held beliefs and put those in the foreground. And so don't be afraid to do that. I think that's really important.
Thanks, that's really helpful. One of the other questions says, how long should I wait for my op-ed to be published? So that's one question. And then two, can I send my op-ed to multiple outlets at the same time?
So first of all, no. The answer to the second one is no. You really should send it to one outlet at a time. How long should you wait for it to be published? Here's the thing. These days, the news cycle is very, very short. So I really encourage you to, again, look ahead, have some sort of a calendar in your mind. What's coming up? What's a good news hook for me to write on? If I want to write on climate issues, let me look out 2 or 3 months. Is there any major international or national event that's going to give me a news hook? And then I can write to it, having that in the can, if you will, and prepared ahead of that thing coming, as opposed to trying to write to something that is just happening instantaneously. If you're the kind of person who can find time in their schedule and write a quick 800 words because the McCarrick report just dropped today, but nobody knew it was going to come out, that's wonderful. And please do that. And we need you out there. But there are a lot of people who do that for a living and who will be just out there doing it right away. If you're just getting started at this, again, I would look ahead to what's coming down the pike. Having said that, don't pitch it way ahead of time, because busy editors aren't going to be looking to what they're going to publish a month from now, 2 months from now. I would say depending again on the scale of the event, and you should talk to your comms directors or to somebody who's an experienced communications professional, or even the editor of the outlet that you're going to. But I would say 2 weeks ahead, unless it's some enormous, a papal conclave or something like that. 2 weeks ahead or so, say, this is coming down the pike. Here's what I'm writing. Here's what I'm pitching. Thank you for your consideration. If it's that far ahead, give them, I would say, 2 business days. And on the middle of the afternoon of the second business day, you haven't heard anything, get back to them. Thank you for considering this. After another 24 hours, I'm going to look for another outlet for it, but really appreciate working with the opportunity to work with you in the future. Again, you're trying to build a relationship and you're trying to be professional. So don't pester them, and don't, and just treat it like that. Treat it like a real relationship. And people will generally get back to you, and in some form or another. Sorry, I already have somebody working on that, but I hope to work with you next time. Again, this is all great information to have. And I just encourage you to get words on the screen and get those opinion pieces out there. It is much easier than you think. You all write well more than 800 words every day in the emails you send to people. Just get it out and get it started, because that's the way that you're going to build up relationships, even through all these rejection emails, and build up the practice of learning what works and what doesn't.
One of the other questions that I think has emerged recently is once your op-ed is placed, or your opinion, in some, even if it's a long form opinion, and then it's social media land, right? So where I'm going to post this to Twitter, I'm going to put a link in my Instagram bio, I'm going to get this on Facebook. Any recommendations on how to manage that? And then particularly, and I'll say this, I think we cast this as a civic dialogue, opportunity to advance civic dialogue. What do I do with the comments section underneath? What do you do in response if you see, again, the vitriol, the hostility to something that you put heart and energy into? How do you manage that?
Sure, that's a great question. I should have talked more about social media. Because of course that's the biggest way to leverage what you're doing. Let me first talk about the issue of how to get your work out there through social media, and then talk a little bit about how you handle the hostility and divisiveness. As soon as something's written, you should really look for organizational partners to help promote it. So on one hand, the outlet that is publishing it should obviously be promoting it. And again, they'll usually have a good media, they'll have a good social media schedule, they'll have a plan, they should be already promoting it well. Your organization should be promoting it through their various social media platforms as well. And personally, you should be reaching out to anyone you know or have contact with that has a somewhat large social media platform, or simply relationships that are important to you, right? That will get it in front of people who might be able to influence this. And that's just the standard, to my mind, that's a standard thing. I've just written this piece published at American Magazine. I'd love it if you could help promote it. And if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them. Something like that. But again, your institute, the magazine, the outlet should be promoting it. Any institution you're related to should have a social media schedule to promote it across their various platforms. And your friends and contacts that you feel comfortable reaching out to can be doing that as well. And again, this is a scheduled thing. There are all sorts of metrics out there for when it's the best time to post and how often to post and whatever. And I'm sure that you can either look that up online, or your comms directors can help you with that. In terms of hostility and division, I will say that I never look at comments boxes, and I think that's a waste of time and energy for everybody. I think to my mind, conversations around these issues happen on Twitter, and that's important. Twitter is a place where journalists are often looking, and often, to my mind, that's kind of the benefit of Twitter. Journalists are on there, they're carrying conversations forward. And so if you have replies or people commenting in a way that is helpful and advancing the conversation, please feel free to engage there with them, I think. But at the same time, please also feel free to stop. You should not be in anything past one or two replies, I always shut it down then. That's just too long, and nobody's following you at that point. You're just trying to convince one person. So if it's somebody influential or somebody who you want to engage with, or there's a personal reason to do that, that's great. But just know that there's a lot of diminishing returns there. I also don't engage in debate online. I just think that's, again, I might have a back and forth of one or two things for clarification or for encouragement, frankly, or to recognize that someone can have a disagreement or a different point of view. But sort of a back and forth trying to win a debate is so unproductive. So I just discourage that kind of engagement that's too time consuming. This is a place to really get it out to the most people. And the thing that you're trying to convey is that you're not part of that divisive discussion. You're part of effective communication. So.
That distinction is very helpful. I think many of us, you get sucked in, particularly if you spent a tremendous amount of energy on it and you feel passionate about it, which is almost the only reason you're writing an op-ed in the first place. So yeah, that's really great advice. And I liked your framing at the beginning about the pastoral perspective, right? Like we're taking kind of that as part of the charge. It's not just a matter of, am I persuading someone, but am I thinking about their full humanness as they're receiving the message?
And can I just speak to that a little, Bethany? I think that's really, really important. If you are a religious honest call, I mean, that people really are looking to you for that. And that should be your number one frame when you're writing something. So they will, if you are not pastoral in your approach, if the way you come up, you just don't have the freedom to engage in the kind of back and forth that other people might. And so please do frame it that way. I also really want to encourage you, if you haven't had the chance to read Fratelli Tutti yet, I really encourage you to do that, because Pope Francis has so much to say about digital communication in there. And one thing he says is that obviously it's not a substitute for real relationship. And he talks about the downside of it and the fact that it's very hard to communicate in that way. That's not to give it up, but it simply is to say, don't spend too much of your energy there. Your idea is to convey that we are Catholics in the public square and that we are here to effectively persuade and bring our messages, bring our themes and teachings to the public square. But at the same time, we're not there to promote division. We're not there to be hostile. If we do that, we are not witnessing to our faith.
Any closing questions as we wrap up here? I'm going to then just give a quick mention for wrap up, but any other questions? I'm just looking at the chat. As I mentioned at the outset, we do record the webinar, so it will be posted to the CMSM website. And then what I'll do is I'll send a link for kind of a feedback survey around, as well as point you to where on the website this lands. We do have a wonderful comms director at CMSM. So if you are part of the major superiors or you work for an institute ministry program that's related to us, certainly I'm not going to offer you all of Susan's time, but there are ways that we could help you and support you in this process of learning to shape your voice and to get it out there. And then in January, February, and March, we'll also have additional webinar spaces similar to this one to continue kind of building up our skill set, particularly on things that touch on the justice and peace work. So anybody else before we close out? Okay, Kim, any closing thoughts from you as we wrap up?
Mostly, I would just say I really encourage, first of all, Susan's great. You should all reach out to anybody, to Susan or to other comms directors, because they'll have very specific advice and they will know, by the way, the outlets in your area and outlets that might be reachable by you. So I would definitely encourage you to talk with people in your specific situations about who you can reach, number one. Number two, please don't discount local outlets or smaller outlets to start, especially. But there are times when you can definitely shoot higher, particularly if you have relationships. And number three, I really just encourage you to do this. It's not as hard as it looks. And once you get in the process and once you get your words down on paper or up on that screen, you're going to be really, really happy with the result.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, and go with all of our prayers for this work that you're doing, especially, in the next few weeks and leading up to the inauguration. I do think, your voice and the voice in the Institute is just bringing people together in a really meaningful way. So thank you so much for that.
Thank you.
All right. Blessings, everybody. Have a great afternoon or evening. Bye-bye.